Hello everyone, and welcome to our open house. This is one of several open houses that we've done here at Berklee Music. My name is Michael Moyes, and I'm a student advisor here at Berklee Music. We're the online division of the Berklee College of Music, if I didn't just mention that. And I'm also a orchestrator and producer and a writer. And I'm lucky to be joined by Dan Thompson today. What we're going to do is we're going to have about 20 minutes of a discussion between Dan and I, and then we're going to open it up to question and answers for all of you for about 10 minutes or so. So Dan is the assistant chair of the music production and engineering department here at the Berklee College of Music, where he's taught classes such as advanced production, recording and mix techniques, and audio technology for over 15 years. I believe it's almost 17 years
Almost 17,
now,
yeah, in January.
which is great.
Yep.
He's also the main author and main professor for two of our most popular online classes, Critical Listening 1 and Advanced Audio Ear Training for Mix Engineers.
Yes.
He himself is an independent writer, producer, and recording engineer, as you might imagine. And his credits include work on all sorts of records, feature films, and television shows, such as ER, The Sopranos, Swimfan, The Sweetest Thing, Melrose Place, Sabrina the Teenage Witch, NCIS, and many
all
other
favorites.
Personal favorites of mine as well. Dan has authored articles for EQ and Electronic Musician, and his book, Understanding Audio, is a staple not only here at the Berklee College of Music, but also in MP&E programs all across the globe. So we're very lucky to have you here, Dan. Thanks for joining us.
Good. Yeah, thanks.
So Dan, as I mentioned before, teaches our Critical Listening 1 class, and that class, in that course, you have students listen to a very broad range of artists from different kind of genres. Why did you pick those particular tracks to have the students listen to, and what do they have in common?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, as you say, throughout the course, there are a lot of listening examples. We also have a long list of recommended listening, and what they have in common really is that they were all done by great engineers, often with great producers, and given the experience of the people involved with them, there's an expertise in capture and mix. And what you get in those instances is the result is a recording that has a breadth, a depth that almost the recording disappears and you are engaged by the music. And you know, the common thread really throughout all the classes we teach is that the end goal is the music and the making a connection with the listener. That's what, you know, any artist that you're working with, that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to connect with an audience. And so to the extent possible, you want the engineering, the recording, the mixing to serve that, you know. One of the pitfalls, particularly as an up-and-coming engineer, as a student, is that there are a lot of techniques to learn. There's a lot of gear to learn, of course, and it's fun. I mean, gear is fun, and it's easy to get lost in the minutia of the gear and forget, sort of zoom out and forget, you know, what the end goal is. And the end goal is really that musical experience, having great material that you're working with, and then kind of making the technology in a way disappear so that the artist's intent can really come through.
Right.
And so in these most of the recordings that we're listening to, that's really what has happened. And so what we do is sort of dig into, well, how did that happen? You know, how did the engineer make such a broad soundscape or fit so many elements? There are a lot of really interesting musical elements. How do they possibly fit together without stepping over each other? How do they all help to tell the story of the piece? And so that's what's really interesting. As you say, across genres, there is that same goal sort of supersedes anything else. And so you know, you'll see great engineers who work, in fact, in while some have specialties. Of course, jazz and classical is a very particular thing. The great engineers can really transcend genre and make great recordings and great mixes in any situation.
Can you give an example of how one of these great engineers would zero in and really make a big impact on a record?
Sure. So it starts at the beginning with the musicians, and I'll definitely come back to this often. First of all, you have to start with great material, and great material does a lot for you as an engineer. Somehow everything sounds better when you're working on great material. When you're working on material that's not quite there, everything is just harder. It just really is. So, the engineers who have reached a certain stature, one of the great advantages that they have is that they're working with great artists on really good material and with great players. And one of the lessons that you will learn if you're interested in engineering, the better musician you work with, the more of a genius you are as an engineer. Obviously there is thought that goes into mic choice and placement and room setup and all of that. But basically, you put up some mics on Vinnie Colaiuta, and the drums are going to sound great. And so it makes the rest of the job, much easier. In terms of specific example, Elliot Scheiner. Basically, anything that he has done. And he's one on the list. Engineers, anything that Al Schmidt has done, listen to. Anything that Elliot Scheiner has done, listen to. And what you'll find is the uncanny ability to have things sit in their place, and be clear. And there are no elements that are fighting. One of the tracks that we use a lot in the course. And as I say in the course, by the end, it's either your favorite track or your worst nightmare, because we come back to it several times, each time with a different ear to something that's going on. And by the end, you realize there is so much there. And part of the goal is to be able to listen to a track on several different levels at the same time. So there's the song itself. There are the chord changes, things that you would typically gravitate to, as any musician would gravitate towards the lyrics, the melody, the song, the structure. But then, okay, what do the drums specifically sound like? What does the kick drum sound like? And then we get into sort of the general EQ landscape. You can think of a recording or a mix as you have a certain amount of real estate. So there's a lot of things going on. In a way, a multi-track recording is something of an artificial event where you're taking individual elements, you're recording them often one by one. Sometimes you're doing a basic session, so you're capturing multiple things at once. But ultimately, you've got a lot of things, and you only have, for the most part, 2 channels. There is obviously surround and multi-channel, but most of the audio that we experience is stereo. And so the challenge of fitting that in is a big part of what a mix engineer, for instance, has to deal with.
You mentioned so many different elements of the process. Digging into the different instruments and the EQ and the reverb and different things like that. How important is it to get into the specifics versus looking at the whole big picture?
Yeah, the challenge is you have to do both. So let's take it from a mix perspective. So we're breaking down a mix, or we're doing a mix. You start with the whole. So you're going to get a mix up and have the relative elements, the drums, the bass, start to work together. So you're massaging levels, you're getting a mix, and at a certain point, you realize, that acoustic guitar and that vocal are not working together. There's somehow the vocal feels veiled, and at that point, within the context of the whole, now you can zoom in. You've identified the problem, not from, you haven't soloed the vocal and go, oh, is that a good vocal? No, that doesn't matter. No one's ever going to hear the vocal alone, or no one's ever going to hear the kick drum alone. So it's a question of how do each of those elements fit into the whole? And once you've identified a need within the context, now you can go ahead and, solo the vocal, okay, it's feeling a little muffled. In order to find this is the problem. So now I need to solo, find that frequency, and pull it down. And then check it again in the mix, and sure enough, okay, there it is. Or there's a specific frequency that you have to cut out from one so that the other can breathe. You can do that in isolation, but you've asked and answered the question globally,
right? If
that makes sense.
Yeah, it definitely does. One of the names of your classes, which I mentioned earlier, is one of the more intimidating names that we have here. Advanced Audio Ear Training for Mix Engineers. Right. What is...
It seemed more interesting than critical listening too.
Yeah,
so.
True. And it's more descriptive. It tells you exactly what you're going to be doing.
Right.
But what is audio ear training, and why do we spend our time doing something like that?
Sure. So audio ear training specifically has to do with finding a relationship, understanding a relationship between frequency and timbre, if you will. So most of us, again, as musicians, we think of things as high or low, shrill, etc. As an engineer, our interaction with those, let's say a cello, if we're dealing with a cello within a mix and somehow the timbre, it needs something, there's a resonance that's bothering us, the way that we deal with that is with EQ, and EQ works on frequency. There's no less brittle knob, So basically what we have to do is start to make an association between characteristics, timbral characteristics, and frequencies specifically. So audio ear training is essentially to help us do that. It's basically to identify what are the characteristics of frequencies and how they affect the timbre, the sound of various instruments.
I live in I'm going to be a little greedy now since I have personal questions that kind of do tie in, and I'm sure a lot of you have the same questions. I live in a kind of an apartment situation where I can't have studio monitors, so it's hard to really get those frequencies down.
Yeah.
So I try to do some mixing with headphones. Is that advised, or?
Well, yeah. I mean, yes and no.
Okay.
In a compromised environment, yes, it's a reasonable thing. By having over-the-ear headphones, it removes the environment. And in fact, in certain contexts, it can reveal certain details that you might not otherwise hear over speakers. So the best case scenario is that you do both. The thing is, headphone listening, first of all, it isn't that much fun.
No.
It's not that comfortable. It feels isolating. And it also, there's a closedness to the sound that is not ideal. So in an ideal situation, and we work on this in the course, trying to improve the acoustics of the room, trying to improve your scenario so that you can, in fact, do speaker listening as well.
Okay.
Try to set up a critical listening environment. But even in that instance, it's not a bad idea to have some headphones and be checking. And in fact, if you're doing QC, quality control, for, let's say, a mastering engineer, you're going to do that on headphones because little things, little pops, little anomalies that might get obscured in speaker listening would actually show up under headphone listening conditions.
How important is it to have your headphones as flat as possible?
Well, what's most important is to understand what they're doing. Most speakers, most headphones are not flat. In fact, most gear that claims to be flat is not flat. And by flat, we mean a flat frequency response. So essentially, it's across the frequency spectrum. Sound going in, signal going in, is reproduced at the same level coming out. What's more important than flat response from speakers and from headphones is really understanding what they're doing. A big part of your job as a mixer, as an engineer, has to do with translatability. Okay. So in other words, having something sound great in your headphones or on your speakers is not that helpful if it sounds terrible elsewhere. And again, part of why you want to work on your room, dealing with room modes and things that color the sound, is that you want to be able to count on translatability of your mixes, taking your mix out and having it sound the same as what you thought you were doing.
Right.
That's one of the big challenges. And so, yes, having speakers that are wildly off, or headphones that are wildly off, that are, you know, greatly exaggerating the bass, or don't have enough top end, or have a hyped top end, have much too much sort of high frequency, exaggerated high frequency, that's not an ideal situation, particularly because you will then tend to underemphasize. So for instance, you have headphones that have been hyped so that they sound good, and that seems like, oh, well, I like listening to them. That's great for listening if you find that pleasurable, but for mixing, what's going to happen is you will assume that there's a lot of high-frequency content in your mix, and you're going to underdo it. And then you're going to take it out, and all of a sudden your mix sounds really dull. So from that perspective, yes, not having greatly exaggerated high-end, low-end, other anomalies is an important thing.
Right.
But most important is to learn your speakers, learn your headphones, and see how they translate. The way you do that is by having recordings that you know.
Right.
And that's definitely something that we recommend both to, you know, the critical listening students, to our students in the program. You have to build up your reference listening library.
Kind of calibrate your ears.
Absolutely. That's the first piece. What you'll find is that, you know, the ear-brain connection is so interesting. From one day to the next, your perception can be actually wildly different in terms of your concept of how much high-end or low-end there is. Having reference listening helps exactly that, calibrate your ears, so that you say, okay, I know that this, for 5 years I've been listening to this, I know this sounds great, I know what it sounds like, let me pop it in, and I get accustomed to, okay, I'm calibrating my ear, sort of the ear-brain connection, and also getting calibrated to my environment at that moment. And so if you have that goalpost, now you have something to shoot against.
Okay.
In fact, what you'll see also, if you you know, if you were a fly on the wall in a mixed setting, in any studio, you would typically find a bunch of reference recordings, because even as you're doing, okay, now let's track some background vocals, and you've got arrangement ideas, you're constantly, you know, we don't produce in a vacuum. That doesn't mean that we're copying or that we're not being original, but really, you have to have a benchmark, and you have to be comparing yourself so that you know, okay, ooh, do I have enough vocal? Now, we get used to that, and we start to have a sense of where the vocal wants to be, but it's actually really helpful to then pop in something. I'm doing a jazz thing, putting in
and you actually do it right there? You'll stop what you're doing and put in some reference material?
Absolutely.
Wow.
Do a little A-B for a minute to make sure we're headed in the right direction. You're doing a jazz vocal thing, put in a CD by Al Schmidt, a Diana Krall CD. It's a humbling experience, but it's a necessary one. Sometimes we're afraid to, we don't want to, and it's true, you don't want to stop the creative flow, but you do need a reality check.
Sure.
And that's how you learn. That's really how you get better.
Great. Another kind of greedy question, but I think all of you are going to be very interested in this as well, since we have kind of an authority figure here. Sites like SoundCloud and other ones where you can actually see the waveform of what you've uploaded. Since I do a lot of orchestral music, there'll be tiny pianissimos and giant fortissimos and crescendos. However, a lot of the music that's on there is really compressed and it almost looks like there's a brick of sound.
Yeah, sure.
What are your opinions about the use of compression in music today?
That's a tough one. It's been an ongoing debate for the past 15 years, let's say. Essentially, we refer to that as the loudness wars, where essentially everyone wants they know that they're going to be compared to something else, and psychologically we tend to find something that's louder better. In a surface sort of way. Most listeners, if you're given two things and one of them is slightly louder, most listeners will say that the louder one sounds better. And so that has led to the desire to to get things louder and louder, and one of the ways you do that is through compression. You basically squash the top and bring the whole thing up so that the difference between the loudest passages and the softest passages is much less. Part of that comes from radio. Everything on radio is squashed, and so it's easy to bash compression. At the same time, I think, again, it goes back to what's appropriate. So what is the musical intent? How are we going to engage the listener? And if compression or even over-compression does that, then that's your answer. But what I would say is that it's overused more than it needs to be. And essentially, what you do when you limit the dynamic range, when you squash something like that, you're taking away one of the tools that you have to grab your listener. I mean, obviously, in classical music, as you know, one of the big sort of emotional instruments is the dynamic range, going from that pianissimo to the big thing. Is so dramatic, and it just engages you in a visceral way. And so when you squash something to the point of having no dynamics, you're basically removing one of the arrows out of your quiver that you have to make that connection.
Right.
And now you need to find other ways to do that.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's not a black and white answer, but I would say that compression is one of those things that is worth digging into and really listening to what is the result. Because it's tempting to just go, oh, compressor solves everything, and boom, we squash it, and oh yeah, that sounds better, and we're not really listening. And did we lose all the nuance of that lead vocal?
Right.
All of a sudden, I'm disengaged.
Yeah.
So I mean, some people would argue that, generally speaking, the disengagement that we've seen in popular music over the last 20 years, is at least partly tied to that. When you listen to older records that have more dynamic range, somehow they seem more emotionally compelling.
Right.
Now, that's a broad, statement. don't hold me to that, but you get what I'm saying.
Yeah.
There's definitely an arc to this, and so I would just hammer again the notion that it's really tool for the task. As long as you keep, in your sights that it's the goal is musical, no matter what tools you're using. The goal is musical. The goal is emotional, connecting with an audience, and that answers all of your questions. That answers, what we do.
Well, we burned through 20 minutes, no
wow,
problem
okay.
here,
Right.
which is too bad. I wanted to. Well, there's a lot of questions here from students. One thing to keep in mind when you're answering these. I wanted to ask you what are some differences or some things that are covered in the second class, the advanced audio training that's not in critical listening one. So just keep that in mind because I imagine some of these questions will be topics that are in that second class. Hi, Dan. I must work in mono as I can only hear in one ear. Are there any tips to ensure as balanced a mix as possible hearing only in mono?
Wow, that's a great question. Challenging. So, interestingly, you have one advantage, and that is that if you get balances to work well in mono, they work great in stereo. And in fact, that's a technique for mixing, is start your mix in mono. Don't pan anything out. Start your mix in mono and really get the balances working. As I said, we're trying to fit a lot of stuff into a limited amount of space. So panning is one of our tools. EQ is one of our tools. Balance is obviously over time, changing balance over time. This is not a static thing. But if you get your mix to actually sound balanced in mono, then the next trick is you can, in fact, switch back and forth between left and right. And I've had colleagues, actually spectacular engineers, who have gone deaf in one ear. And one of the things they did or do is to switch, basically mute the left and the right alternately, and you get a sense of the balance between the two. The other thing is there's some rules of thumb that you can follow. For instance, the way a good stereo mix works is by using counterpoint. You're familiar with counterpoint.
It's
right down your alley. Basically, one of the temptations, since we can record everything in stereo, every synth has stereo outputs, etc., is to record everything in stereo. But in fact, it's more compelling. There's a more compelling stereo image that's generated when you use a bunch of mono elements and you pan them opposite each other.
Really?
Absolutely. And so you get a counterpoint that is, so for instance, two individual guitars. Rather than recording them in stereo, record them each in mono and then pan them opposite each other. And you get this interplay, rhythmic interplay, that is a stereo effect within the mix, and it's much more compelling than just a single, stereo guitar. So I would, go through your elements and sort of divvy up between left and right. And, you can use some visual cues. So you don't want everything panned hard left and right. You're trying to fill out the stereo spectrum. And you can use it as something of a math problem. So you're basically, you want to end up with an even number of things that have similar sort of activity. So for instance, you wouldn't want to pan something that's kind of steady state with something that's very moving, and that be the only counterpoint. Things that are steady state, pan them away from each other. Things that have similar counterpoint, pan them away from each other. So for instance, the hi-hat, which is active, might get panned against a piano, which is doing this, right? And so you get a nice counterpoint. And then, again, I would just switch back and forth, alternately mute your left and your right, and make sure that it feels balanced to you. But it's a real challenge.
Yeah.
It's a great question.
Yeah. Here's a question from Chris. Bob Clearmountain advocates mixing the whole track with the vocal playing from the get-go.
Yeah.
What's your view on this? Would you mix the drums first without the vocal playing?
It's yeah. It really depends. The most fascinating thing, one of the things that I love about teaching at Berklee, is that almost like no one else, we get the opportunity to watch some of the best in the world work. So we come in, we have visiting artists. Bob Clearmountain has been our visiting artist. Elliot Shiner, Al Schmidt. We've had all of these folks with us and spent time with them in the studio and watched them work. And one of the fascinating things is that while their output is stunning, you listen to any of their records and they're stunning, the way they get there is entirely individual, entirely unique. And so, yes, Bob absolutely starts with the vocal, and that makes total sense. If you think about it, what is again, coming back to the emotional, grabbing someone emotionally, it's really the vocal that we're listening to. Regardless of how sophisticated or unsophisticated you are, you're listening to the vocal and the lyric telling a story. So making everything else subservient to that makes total sense. If you watch Elliot Shiner mix, he starts with the kick, and he works his way up, and he does his balance. By the time he gets over here, he's done. And it works. You listen to those records, they're spectacular. And yet it's 180 degrees from Bob's approach. So again, I would say find a method that works for you that serves the music. That's really the answer, and there isn't one approach.
Can you give some, I know we talked about this a little bit more at the beginning, but can you give some examples of some of the recordings that you use as reference material?
Sure. So, yeah, one of the ones we use a lot, obviously, is Steely Dan, Elliot Shiner, Babylon Sisters we come back to quite a bit. Al Schmidt, Diana Krall, we use some of that. I mean, it goes... We use Black Eyed Peas, we use Madonna tracks, we use Coldplay and Fountains of Wayne. I mean, it's kind of all over the map. It spans the gamut, and I would say the thing that they all have in common is that, I'll use the Madonna track, for instance. We use this track Music, which we use specifically to talk about delay, use of delay.
Okay.
And it's just from that perspective, that particular perspective, it's really interesting. Not only creative use of delays as we hear them, a slapback delay, a delay that's timed,
Right.
that one is filled with tempo-based delays. But also there's this moment where the entire left channel of the mix is delayed just by a millisecond. And what happens is you get, it's a psychoacoustic phenomenon where your brain, when presented with two things and one being slightly delayed, it assumes that it's just a pan delay. So in other words, when something is here, it reaches this ear before it reaches this ear, and the brain goes, oh, it must be coming from
Gives you the
here.
whole-
Exactly.
Wow.
And so the entire mix goes to one side, and yet if you look at the level meters, they're both going. There's full information on both.
Huh.
So that's a really cool example that, it shows kind of two different things.
How did you get pulled into your interest? What equipment did you use, and what kind of equipment would you recommend for somebody who doesn't have a studio?
Okay, good question. So for someone starting out, obviously there are a lot of tools now that are available in the box, and so I would say that's the place to start. As you get further along, I would say the number one thing is microphones, to be honest. Assuming that you're working with acoustic music. Obviously, if you're doing primarily electronic music, that can be in the box. But in terms of, we deal with microphones, mic preamps, compressors, EQs, everything down the chain. That's all the equipment that we use, our recording platform, etc. Of all of those things, and we get into minutia of, okay, what is the word clock source, and what are the A to D converters, and each of those things make incremental differences. So the better you can do at each stage, the better your outcome will be. Of all of those things, I would say your microphones make the biggest difference. Mm-hmm. And that's assuming, I'm going to come back to my original point, which is start with great players, start with great material, and that'll get you much further than any of the equipment.
Right.
But beyond that, microphones.
Great. Well, believe it or not, we have
Wow.
exhausted
Okay.
our time here. I'll have to have you
All
back
right.
for some more.
Happily.
But thank you for coming. It's been great having you here.
My pleasure.
And to all of you attendees out there, thank you very much for attending. And again, thank you very much, Dan.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.